Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining me tonight. Again, my name is Caleigh McAuley. I'm a registered dietitian with Celiac Canada. And today we're diving into a topic that I think causes a lot of confusion and stress for people living with celiac disease, and that's gluten cross-contact. So my goal tonight is to help you understand what actually matters, what the research is showing, and how to protect yourself without feeling overwhelmed. Here's what we're covering today. First, we'll define what cross-contact actually is. Then we'll look at how risk differs depending on situation, because we know that not all cross-contact is created equal. We'll review some of the research and what it shows, including some surprising findings. And finally, we'll build a realistic, sustainable prevention strategy to support both safety and quality of life, because that's important too. So what is gluten cross-contact? I'm sure many of you already know, but cross contact happens when gluten transfers from one food or surface to another food or surface. Crumbs on a dirty cutting board, pasta cooked in shared water, a shared fry oil, or even unwashed hands. So the contact happens when gluten moves. It doesn't multiply, it doesn't disappear with heat, it transfers. So you can see here I put up some visual examples, but you can see that visual crumbs are in butter, which is a common example here of cross contact. It can happen in other condiments too, like peanut butter or jam. And then, of course, a messy countertop with clearly lots of visible crumbs. So cross-contact and cross-contamination. You'll hear these terms used interchangeably, and even in the literature you hear it today, but they're not the same. And cross-contamination, it refers to bacteria or pathogens, things that can multiply and be killed with heat. Cross-contact, on the other hand, refers to allergens, so like gluten. Gluten does not multiply and it's not destroyed by heat. So this is why cleaning with soap and water, it's so important for gluten. And why sanitizing, on the other hand, is important for bacteria. And I think I just wanted to differentiate between the two because I will be using cross-contact in this presentation today. And I think also understanding the difference between the two terms helps us focus on the right prevention strategies and helps us really understand why cleaning with soap and water is so important for gluten. So not all cross-contact situations carry the same risk. And I wanted to put this slide right up front at the top of my presentation, because I think this is the backbone for today's presentation. One of the biggest misconceptions is that every situation carries the same level of danger, and that's simply not true. Risk exists on a spectrum. Some higher risk examples are situations that include shared pasta water, shared fryer oil, flour-heavy environments, visible crumbs, and double-dipped condiments. Some lower risk situations, when properly cleaned, include countertops, pots, pans, utensils, and shared kitchen surfaces. I think this is really where we start shifting away from that fear-based thinking to evidence-based thinking. And when I'm teaching people about cross-contact now, I really, really try to move away from the black and white thinking and yes or no answers or safe versus unsafe, and really move towards a risk assessment approach. And I think that's where celiac disease is moving anyways, but talking about higher risk situations versus lower risk situations, and it helps people understand. So why does this matter anyways? So Celiac disease, it's an autoimmune condition, and healing depends on strict gluten avoidance. The tricky part is that damage can occur even without symptoms, and risk accumulates across meals and across days. So small exposures, they add up over time. And this is why understanding meaningful risk is so important. I also wanted to just put a visual up here. This image helps just show how small 10 milligrams of gluten actually is, which is the amount of gluten that's considered to be tolerable for most people with celiac disease. This is from Gluten-Free Watchdog, and you can see she compares a crumb to a coin, and you can really see the difference and just how small that amount really is. And you can see it on the plate here too. So there are a lot of myths and misconceptions out there, and I hear so many of them online and so many when people come in to see me. It can make people feel unnecessarily restricted. Things like you must separate everything or gluten stays forever. You can never eat out again. You need two of everything. All shared equipment is unsafe. These statements are simply rooted in fear and not evidence. Today, we're going to try to replace these myths with a little bit of clarity, and that's my goal here. Okay, so starting off, naturally gluten-free foods. This is the category where I think is the most under-recognized sources of gluten cross-contact, and that's naturally gluten-free foods. People often assume that if a food is naturally gluten-free, that it must automatically be safe for someone with celiac disease. But cross-contacts can happen long before food reaches your kitchen. So multiple studies have looked at this and found high rates of gluten cross-contact in foods such as oats. Oats is a great example. It's naturally gluten-free, and we cannot have any unless it's labeled gluten-free because of the high risk of cross-contact. And that's the same with some other grains and flours that I listed here. They're at higher risk of cross contact. So lentils, we always recommend that if you can't find any gluten-free, lay them on a baking sheet. You can visually see any foreign particles, pick them out, and make sure to rinse thoroughly. Flours should be always labeled gluten-free. Even corn flour, a lot of people are surprised by this. Corn flour should be labeled gluten-free. Almond flour should be labeled gluten-free. And oftentimes there are. Or they are labeled gluten-free, as you can see on here. I put some examples, but it's important because they are at higher risk of contamination. And this makes sense when you look at how food moves through the system. There's many grains and seeds grown, transported, stored, or processed alongside the wheat-containing products. I really like how Trisha Thompson, Gluten-Free Watchdog, she's explained that cross-contact can happen even before processing begins. And she gave an example, and I think it's, I really liked the example, so I thought I'd share. But she said, a flock of geese flying over a field and dropping their business may carry wheat, barley, or rye seeds from one field to the other. So there's lots of things that we can control, but that's not one of them. So because of all of this and the research, what the research has shown, we always recommend high-risk foods be purchased with a gluten-free claim so that the risk of contamination is much lower. So if you're confused about, I won't go into detail, but if you're unsure which foods are considered higher risk, Celiac Canada outlines them in our labeling guide, and that's available at celiac.ca. But always choose gluten-free versions for high-risk foods. All right, so shared pasta water. It's one of the clearest examples of gluten transfer when you look at the research. Earlier studies, they consistently found high levels of gluten when gluten-free pasta was cooked in shared water. More recent studies, I think it was a study done in 2021, but it was a restaurant-style study. So it found increased levels over time with larger batches or restaurant style portions. So, and this is because gluten disperses in the water and pasta directly absorbs contaminated water. So our recommendation is to always use separate or fresh pasta water to cook your gluten-free pasta and properly clean cookware like colanders. This is also really important when you're thinking about restaurants too. When you're eating out at restaurants, it's always important to ensure that they're using fresh water too, because sometimes they don't know. Okay, so shared fryer oil. Research on this has shown highly variable results, actually. So some studies found lower levels than we expected. Others, including the Thompson shared fryer study, found fry samples significantly above 20 ppm. And the variability, it likely reflects differences in a few different things. So breading volume, how much food is battered there, what are they cooking, the oil turnover, how often do they change their oil. If it's freshly cleaned oil, it's going to be different than old oil that was used all day. Filtration systems and kitchen practices. So there's a lot of variability here, and that's the reason why we still consider shared fryers one of the higher risk situations, just because it can be really difficult to predict, especially in busy commercial kitchens. So recommend avoiding foods cooked in shared fryers. Airborne flour. So flour behaves very differently than crumbs because it becomes airborne extremely easily. Researchers studying active baking environments, they found that flour particles can spread through the air and land on your food. So these particles, it's not about them getting on your skin or anything. It's really about them settling on to nearby food and surfaces and then you consuming that. One study looked at commercial kitchens and found risk significantly decreased with distance. So they tested it and about 2 meters or roughly 6.5 helped controlled setup. But you have to remember that there's lots of factors at play like ventilation, airflow, room size, and the amount of flour being used. It all influences risk here. Also, it's very different from being near sealed bread or someone eating gluten nearby, very different situation. So I think the highest concern here is being close to large amounts of active flour use. So things like pizza kitchens where they're throwing up dough and flour's getting everywhere, or bakeries. I do know some people who work in these situations and it's like they're fine, but that we have to consider the barriers. So they would use masks and wash their hands very frequently. And sometimes it works for people, sometimes it doesn't. So there's lots of considerations here, lots of variables, and you'll see that's a consistent pattern through this whole presentation. So shared condiments. I think this is one of the most practical examples of cross-contact. One recent study looked at products like peanut butter, jam, mayo, condiments, and after they used knives, they used it on gluten-containing bread, were dipped back into the containers, and what they found was that risk, again, it was variable, but visible crumbs and repeated dipping increase the likelihood of gluten transfer. And this makes sense because visible crumbs, they contain concentrated gluten. And over time, when you repeat that dipping, it can increase the number of crumbs in shared jars or containers. So the good news is it's a very simple and easy problem to solve. Some simple strategies here are using separate jars, squeeze bottles, very common in the summertime with barbecues, or avoid double dipping altogether. They can all dramatically reduce your risk here. So restaurants and dining out, this can be really challenging because risk varies enormously depending on protocols. A shared kitchen does not automatically mean it's unsafe. What matters more is staff training, prep practices, shared fryers. Do they use fresh pasta water? Are their surfaces clean? And communication. So some restaurants you'll notice have excellent systems in place and others do not. That's just the reality of things. I think one of the most important skills when we're teaching people how to handle restaurants is learning how to ask questions, assess the risk, and then decide your own comfort level. I think ask questions. I think this is one of the most obvious, but again, dedicated fryers, prep spaces. If you notice them feeling confused when you tell them if you have celiac disease and require a strict gluten-free diet, it's likely not a good idea to eat there. So you can really assess the situation, and every situation, again, it's going to be different, and risk varies dramatically depending on protocols. Okay, so shared utensils and cookware. When we look at the research here, there is very reassuring news, and it's that cleaning matters more than the item itself. So research shows that soap and water are highly effective at removing gluten. There are no major differences between wood, plastic, or metal when cleaned properly with soap and water, or with a dishwasher. The real concern here is, again, visible residue or stuck on food, but thorough washing is what keeps things safe. So that's great news. We don't need double of everything in our kitchen. And this is kind of surprising with the research. So appliances, they often cause a lot of anxiety. People are not sure if they should have a separate one, but the research, again, it's more reassuring than people expect. More recent studies tested shared toasters and other kitchen appliances like toaster ovens. They found lower gluten transfer, and cleaning, it significantly reduced the risk. So I say that, but I also say, context matters here. Risk depends on many different factors: crumbs, residue, and the condition of the appliance. Every situation is going to look different. So while the science has become more nuanced, dedicated toasters, they're still often one of the simplest and most practical prevention strategies for many households, especially a toaster, because you can purchase one and they're relatively cheap. Also toaster bags. So you can see in one of the photos here, I have toaster bags. Some people love to use them. Some people use them just for traveling. Others use them in their kitchen every day. You can buy them for relatively cheap on Amazon. For air fryers specifically, there's limited direct research on air fryers. The current thinking is that the main concern here, again, is the residue, not air circulation itself. But again, proper cleaning is the most important. Sponges and dishcloths. So there's very limited direct research here looking at sponges and dishcloths, but based on what we know, gluten transfer, the main concern here is really the spread of visible crumbs and food residue between surfaces. So for example, when you're using a dirty sponge to wipe gluten-containing crumbs across prep, they could spread residue across the kitchen surfaces. On the other hand, clean sponges, they're great. There's no concern at all. So this becomes really more of a practical cleaning and food safety issue, I think, more than a unique gluten issue in itself. Clean sponges, regular washing, replacing old cloths, it all goes a long way. And sometimes when you're not sure, a paper towel is the easiest way to avoid spreading crumbs. Okay, so after going through that, shared kitchens can work, and many families safely manage mixed kitchens every day. Cleaning, organization, communication, and dedicating a few high-risk items can make a huge difference. Simple strategies like a dedicated toaster, separate condiments, clean prep surfaces, and storing gluten-free foods above gluten-containing foods can all help keep things safe and manageable. I also wanted to note, though, every family is different, and what works for one may not work for others, and that's okay too. So I think one of the goals of this presentation is helping people focus their energy where it matters most. Living in constant fear around every surface or hypothetical exposure, it becomes exhausting. The evidence suggests some prevention strategies are much more impactful than others, and we went through this already, but quickly, like washing hands, surfaces, avoiding visible crumbs, avoiding shared pasta water, they are all focused on reducing meaningful risk. And I think that's really where we need to focus our energy. And this slide is the heart of today's message. Really, it's kind of like a balancing act. It's being too relaxed increases risk, but on the other hand, being hypervigilant reduces the quality of life. The goal really is to land somewhere in the middle, and that's informed, realistic precautions that keep you safe, but also allow you to live your life. I think there's so much fear and uncertainty in celiac disease, and we want to reduce that. So landing in that middle where we can have informed, realistic precautions, where we can be safe, but also live our life, because that's what we deserve. And then also evaluating online advice. I think this is so important, especially when it comes to cross contact and all the myths you see on social media. So when you're going through, it's really important to ask yourself, is this evidence-based or feel fear-based? I think that things can feel incredibly powerful emotionally, but they don't always reflect measurable or clinically meaningful risk. Symptoms also vary enormously between individuals. Some people may experience symptoms without measurable gluten exposure. Others may have damage without symptoms at all. So everyone's situation is different. So instead of asking what the internet thinks, it's more helpful to ask, what does the evidence suggest? And what is my comfort level here? It's also important to acknowledge the limitations in this research. So, like many things with celiac disease, the studies are small. Real-life kitchens vary enormously, and repeated low-dose exposure is difficult to study. And the research, it continues evolving. So I think the evidence here, it gives us important guidance, but there's still many things we don't fully know. And that's just the reality. And this is why we combine the evidence, the logic, and the practical experience to make these recommendations. Okay, so to summarize tonight, cross contact, it absolutely matters in celiac disease, but we have to realize that risk is not equal in every situation, and every situation is going to be different. Research helps us identify where gluten transfer is most likely to happen. Some situations consistently show stronger evidence for gluten transfer. Other situations appear much lower risk after effective cleaning. And most importantly, people with celiac disease deserve both safety and quality of life. Here are the references. And thank you all for being here tonight.